is a photo album. My mom kept every article there was that to deal with the case and stuff. And as you go through it, she kept a detailed record of all the police articles, and I guess it was to remind her. I don't know, I wouldn't have done that, but she kept everything she could. My feelings at the time was, why torture yourself, But she loved that man, no matter what. This is after he was arrested. I had been through 3 marriages. Mr. Rogers said, when those ended, I figured there ain't no man out there worth having. Then along came David and changed my mind. I never in my whole life had a man open car doors for me. I've never had anyone buy gifts for me for any reason, bring home flowers, hold my hand whenever you go, wherever you go, and wanted to be with you all the time. That's why everything was such a shock, she said, her voice trailing off. We always talked about things, and this other personality just wasn't there. I know it's hard for people to believe. It never surfaced in David, not in his job, not in his home life. That best describes the whole thing. It was the facade he was putting on. I mean, he was a very good person to her, and she was quite happy, and she did never see it. So that was her opinion of him, and she kept it till the end. She truly loved the man. But his true colors finally came out. That is the wedding picture of them. From the time I met him till they got married was a short amount of time in my eyes. But my mom's happiness was the most important thing. It was everything. I mean, she brought me into this world. She deserved everything she could get. I was happy that he was going to make my mom happy. My father was a drunk, and he abused her a lot. And, he's a cop, so that means he's a good character, supposedly. Like a wolf in sheep's clothing right there. He is. Bonding with David Rogers was a little hard. We were all staying over there at his house, and it was that macho thing, it was his house and the whole thing. He was alpha, he just dominant. He just projected, you do as I say, and in everything. And, he was a typical. And then being a cop kind of made me nervous. Just as a kid who's doing dumb things, and I was pretty much experimenting with drugs at the time, and it made me nervous, to say the least. He had a garden growing in the backyard, and some things to it. And I basically took over the garden, and then I was thinking that'd be the perfect time to sneak in a couple of pot plants, because I had them hidden behind some tomato plants, and got away with it for quite a while. And then I came home one day, and it was in my bedroom, sitting on my bed. He found the plants, he pulled them, dirt and all, put them in the middle of my bed. I was waiting for the scolding that's going to come, or the lecture that's going to come behind it. And he could arrest me, for that if he wanted to. Because it was a felony at the time. And went to dinner, sat down at the table, nothing was said. I kept staring at him, he was looking at me. But I think a lot was really said without being said. It was his way of controlling me, making me squirm and enjoying it. The feeling was terrible, actually. And that went on for a while. Just every time I looked at him, always had that shitty grin. Man never said a word. Never, not one word ever mentioned about it. Ever. It ate me up. Is he trying to hold something over me that he can use later on? But yeah, that was definitely his way of showing that, I'm the man, and well, he was in control. And after that, it was just downhill. I was the oldest of my friends. I had the only vehicle, and I couldn't make it home without being pulled over by a sheriff. Anytime I saw a cop on the way on, I knew I was going to get pulled over. And I'm sure he just said, well, let's give this kid let's make him nervous or something like that. I know he did. You get pulled over like 9 different times in one night by sheriffs. He had something to do with that. Got old real fast after the second and third time, we did nothing wrong. He was just messing with me, which really pissed me off. But nothing I can do about it. But yeah, definitely he was getting off on it completely. I mean, he always wanted control over everything.
But you also knew he had eyes everywhere all over town.
Yeah, he did. And, it was going to make my life miserable. When my mom first met him, my mom had a house on Penny Street. It was supposed to be empty. The thing on my mind was party house. There was like 5 of us in there getting high. And next thing you know, there's door flies open and there's 2 policemen standing there. We were all surrounded, light shining on the house, and just the feeling of being trapped in a room like that. And then in the back of my mind, am I going to be okay over this? Or is it going to be bad, how it's going to play out? And I had a hard time explaining to him, Dave's my stepdad, you need to call him, this is his house. Right at that instant, the door pops open. And he just walked up, stuck his head into the door and looked around, looked at me, but nothing was said. He gave me that look. Like I can do this at any time. It's the way he did things. He just seemed to show up where we were at all the time. Like, it was back before tracking, back before cell phones and everything, but he just seemed to know where I was at all the time. And he'd show up it's kind of weird now that I think about it. He always showed up. But back, it probably was his way of trying to put his hand on top of me, knowing he squished me at any time. Yeah, they called it the Jeep Posse. They all had Jeeps or 4-wheel drives, and they all did everything together. Brothers, basically. That's a typical picture of them. About every other weekend, Dave and my mom on the one end, and then 3 of us partners and a wife there. It was mostly just a gathering of them eating and drinking. That's what they do. And if the women wasn't involved, the bull started. The men would make a bonfire and sit around it, but I didn't want to be with them. So I just would lay back in the background where no one would see me and just listen and observe. And they're all just telling their stories and cleaning their weapons. Dave stood up, all of a sudden, like, it's my time, then to tell his story. And he tells a story of how he had arrested a young man, and he said this guy was getting on his nerve. So he decided he would show him who's boss, and took him down to the river and made him get out of the vehicle and made him kneel by the river. He said, I put my gun to the back of his head, and then he's like, I can do this and get away with it. And I'm sure the guy was scared. I'm sure he was. You have control of their life at the moment. I mean, I don't even want to think about it anymore, about that. It was kind of like him when he just stared at me. He gives that person that thought of what could have been. So once again, it's that controlling factor. He is now in control. And then he put him back in the car, and then he just took him to jail. And I was looking for someone to say something about it. Nothing. Which scared me because he's a cop, he's a cop, and they're supposed to protect people. I thought I knew that man. I didn't know he was doing all that to that extreme. Bakersfield wasn't like it is today. Back then, it was actually a small town. Dave Rogers had the prostitution beat. It was Union Avenue from 58 to, all the way to 178. It was basically the bad part of town, because he requested for that beat, there. He lent me the truck numerous times, and I would run across notes that had, information on females, their age and the whole thing. He would take a picture of them. I don't know why he did that. At the time, I was assuming it was part of his job. But now I know that it wasn't, it was leading into something worse. No telling what was in his evil mind. If it was for sexual fantasies or anything, or because he wanted to do something later, or I don't know.
Was it your idea to be a cop, or did Dave suggest it?
Yeah, I can't really answer that. The sheriff's test came up, I recall that, and I don't know if he encouraged me to do that or I jumped on it. The salary was good, and in a way, I guess I might want to impress him, follow his footsteps or whatever. I really don't know my train of thought at the time, but it sounded like a good thing to do. I would hear him talk to Mom about the authority he had and just his day, he got this crud off the street or he did this and that. And I wanted to be able to do that. If you pull someone over, you're on probation or anything like that, and you do a search, you find a gun and drugs or something like that, he'd just look at the guy and say, well, what's this? And they go, what's what? He goes, exactly. And he'd take the gun, he'd take the drugs. He took them home. That's what he did. And then he abused the women in a different way. God, these poor women too. He pulled over a couple women that were intoxicated. He was going to take the driver to jail for DUI, and he ended up getting her phone number and was going to meet her later. And she didn't get in trouble. She drove away. When he came back to the car, he told me, that's one of the perks of the job. And I was just so confused because he's telling me this, and he's supposed to be loving my mom and the whole works. But how can you love someone and do that?
You think he was testing to see if you'd tell your mom?
That's crossed my mind a few times, but if he was, I passed because I never did.
So why do you think you didn't tell your mom?
I didn't want to hurt her. I didn't care about him. Everything was all about her. She was in love with the man. He was a loving husband with her. The only time I ever saw a good day was when Mom was around. When he wasn't with her, he was like a Jekyll and Hyde. He was a whole different person when he wasn't around her or had anything to directly relate to her. There was this one time I was with him on a ride along. He pulled over a good-looking woman, and he said, well, watch this. And yeah, he got her to remove her top, and, you know, he fondled her breast, and like it was nothing, like it was nothing. And then I feel guilty because maybe he did that just to show it to me, you know. Maybe if I wasn't there, maybe he wouldn't have done that. I don't know. This is hard. I just felt bad because of the shame that she had to feel, the way he acted and treated people. It's like he had no regard for me being there, that I'm witnessing this. Not that I was anything special, but I was his wife's son. So, you know, he didn't even act like he was worried that I would repeat it. I don't know if he was testing me, if I could keep a secret or you know, join the brotherhood. I don't know, it makes me feel like I was a bad person too. I didn't do something about it when it happened, which I should have. And so I'm embarrassed about that part of it. And like, you know, I've tried to suppress the thoughts of it for so long. I just know as a decent human being, you can't let people get away with stuff like that, you know, and I was in a position where I could have done something, and it just kept getting worse. I hate people not thinking good about me because I felt I was a good person, and man, there's just so many things I can't say that, you know, he showed me the bad side of what he does. How you get favors by just abuse of power. He got away with it and just kept going and going and going. I didn't do nothing about it, and I should have. And I just don't know. It comes back. I should have done something. Can I have a second, please?
Yeah.
Just for a second.
Go ahead and cut.
Sitting in a car watching him do something doesn't mean you had something to do with it. He's a police officer.
Yeah, but I wasn't the one in position to do something about it.
We all have moments in our lives where we wish we could have spoken up and done something. And you don't need to be afraid of the truth.
Let's do what we do, right?
Let's give it a shot. All right.
Sorry. God. I really don't know why he confided in me.
It feels like it was something that happened slowly over time.
It escalated to him confiding in me over certain things, like make me be part of him or bond with him or whatever. He dropped the tidbits of it, you know, little bits of information here and there during conversation. If you ever do something real bad, you don't leave evidence. You know, you use the weapon, you get rid of the weapon. You know, you chop up the barrel, so the serial number's gone, get rid of it. Anything you wore, anything you drove, you know, if you keep your truck, you put new tires on it. No witness is the best witness for you, you know, and no evidence is the best, you know. So just, you do what you do. And back then there was a DNA hardly just starting and stuff, so you didn't have to worry about that. He thought he was untouchable. There was plenty of little flags along the way. I don't know what I was thinking at the time. I just wanted to, if anything ever happened, I wanted documented proof that, you know, you can't tell a story unless you can prove it. Things I observed and witnessed, Everything. Anything I witnessed, good and bad. Everything was bad. He found the journal too. I'd left it out. I was just sitting on the couch and I wrote on the coffee table and just left it there. He picked it up, not knowing what it was, and opened it up. And he was he couldn't have been more than a few pages into it when I went in there and I said, "Oh, what do you got in your hand?" It was just a scary thing. Well, I walked in there and saw that it made me nervous that he was reading it. I kind of like, I got caught, my game's up, you know. He goes, "Is this yours?" And I'm like, "Yeah, that's mine. Sure seems like it's got a lot of information about me in it." I said, "Well, come on, Dave, what do you expect, you know? I got to remember things, you know? You told me keep information, that's what you do," because he had always, you know, cops have to write down their stuff so they can remember for the report. So I just write all this stuff down. I didn't write good but there wasn't any. He just threw it down on the coffee table and walked away, and wasn't happy. I saw the disappointment in him, thinking that I would do something like that because I was supposed to be part of his family, you know. Like, are you going to use that against me? Or, you know, what? I don't know what he was thinking about it. It changed his opinion on me. It had to. I never talked to him about it, but after he had seen it and everything, but just quit gathering information. I think I lived a little bit that stopped me because of the fear of what could have happened. I was scared as hell. I still don't know to the day what happened to it. I probably did throw it away. I don't know. I feel guilty over it. I'll live with the fact that, you know, I could have maybe if I had said something. Why didn't I talk to somebody about it? Anybody, you know? I had no one to confide in, and I did nothing. And it ended up with 2 deaths. It makes me feel like that's when I noticed he had a fixation on prostitutes. We would go driving down Union, which was his beat, and he would say, "Hooker, hooker, stay away from her. She's a cop." It was an obsession with him, and I don't know, it's hard to explain.
I think that you saw other stuff, and I'm curious what else you saw.
Uh, that's what I saw. They're just things I'd rather not say.
Well, it feels like in a weird way that you're protecting him a little bit. And I don't
And
get that.
protecting me. Okay, he got me laid by prostitutes a few times. He hooked me up with some of the girls free of cost because of his power. I'm embarrassed about that. It was just, I mean, it's you know, I don't know. It's to look back, just to walk into a room with a stranger and then she's all over you, you know. And he had direct involvement in that, you know. He had something over them and he told them to do this. And at the time, I was just getting laid. I mean, and it's not normal. No, not normal at all. You know, I really don't know to this day why. You know, I think in a way he was grooming me to let me know that when you become a cop, this is what you can get away with. Because people are afraid to say anything about it. Maybe that was his way of holding something over me, you know, and he was probably doing that. Both of them. He was not only grooming me, he was having something over my head just in case. I was just so conflicted that, you know, I wanted to do good, but I knew there was something wrong with that man. There was a time there in Dave's career that a prostitute had made the accusation that he had done some pretty heinous things to her. He had picked her up at the Wiener Schnitzel on Union in California, made her get in his car, drove her to Union Cemetery, made her get out of the car, undressed, and did numerous things to her, and then drove her back to the Wiener Schnitzel and dropped her off. She went in and complained about it, and he got suspended during the investigation. So that gave me the first notion that he may not be as good as he thought he was.
What did he tell your mom when he got suspended?
He denied it, basically. But he let her believe that it was nothing, that it was all bull, and that, everything will be fine. But I know he did it. He told me he did it. Part of me maybe wished that, she'd find out and leave and stuff like that. I'm almost 100% sure she suspected, but she loved the man and she stayed by him. He asked me if I would help him do something. I said, yeah, I'll help you do anything. What? He said, I need to get rid of a few things. I said, okay, what's that? We went to the shed and we pulled out 2 gunny sacks there had to be at least 40 handguns in there, at least. There was and a couple sawed-off shotguns. Maybe because the way he acquired them, he was afraid that they would come out to his house. I could just tell he was in a rush, and we took him someplace and we dumped him in the water. Threw him in the deepest part of the river. I bet they're still there today. I was just trying to help the man, but I had that feeling like I'm doing something really wrong right here, right now. Then when court came, the lady did not show up to court, and nobody stands or butts until they had no case. The feeling or the talk around was that, well, maybe he got rid of her. I don't know. She just didn't show up to testify. And that's all they had was her, that's all they had was her. So he got his job back. But they took him straight to the jailhouse. That's where rookies go, that's where you go in the beginning to earn your time to get out on the street. And that made him angry. And that's when it all went downhill. That's when the vaccination, everything got heated towards hookers because of what she did. I think he was mad because that one tried to take his life away from him or something. He's got some resentment. He hated hookers after that. He hated all women except my mom. He just looked at women, looked at them all, like, sluts, whores, all the above, and he was going to make them pay one way or another. It was a normal day on February the 13th, a Friday. I was working down at the truck stop when my neighbor from across the street called and told me, Tony, there's at least a dozen cop cars at your mom's house, And he said, Tony, what happened? And I said, I don't know. And I went and told my manager, I said, I gotta go. I just hauled ass there. And I went in there, Mom, are you okay? I was more concerned about her. I was just consoling her, and it was so loud in there with all the officers talking. And so that's when I officially found out what his charges were for. murder, two counts of it. And they were all discussing, who's setting him up, who's trying to none of them believed it. None of them believed it. Phone rang, and I think I was the only one who heard it. So I went and I got it, and then I picked it up, and it was that message from the jailhouse saying, you have a call from, Kern County. And I said, hello? And he goes, Tony, let me talk to your mom. She got the phone, and everybody kind of quieted down a little bit. And then it happened. I mean, she slid down in the chair, she turned white, and she said he confessed. She said he confessed. That was the beginning of the end. I mean, I'll never forget that moment in my life. I saw the life drain from my mother, right then, because that was her everything, everything. I lost my mom that day. Unfortunately, didn't even been a 10-day, and I think she was 21 years old. A young prostitute. I think he killed Janine probably early 86. She had been in the canal for quite a few days and was unrecognizable. I mean, they had to go through fingerprints to get her, even though her hands were swollen. I guess somehow they got fingerprints off of her, and they were able to match her up in the database. That's how they found out that was who she was. And they had no clue whatsoever. But she was shot 6 times with the 38. He was even investigating, part of the investigation team that was investigating for that. Investigating a murder he did, but nobody knew. Then I was wondering, well, what was he in there, to try to do something to cover it up, but he didn't need to, because they had nothing at all. I mean, he got away with the first one for a year and 11 days. They would have never busted him on that. They would have never found out, ever. And the second one, Tracy Clark, same canal, same gun, same everything.
So the same gun was used in both murders?
Yes, sir. Same gun, same ammunition. This picture is Tracy Clark, one of his second victim. I think she just got into town that night. And he shot her once, kicked her out of the truck, drove away, came back, and then emptied the gun in her. Then when they did the ballistics, and it was the same gun. She's like 15 and a half years old, and I think she was 6 weeks pregnant. 15 and a half. Wow. I'm sorry for that. And then how many did he do that they don't know about is a thing too. They were investigating the 11 unsolved murders that were related to homeless women or prostitutes or something like that. They asked him a whole bunch of times about that, and he never denied anything. He didn't say he didn't do anything. But yeah, he did 2 that we know, and no telling how many that could have been. I don't know.
Rogers was tried and convicted of both murders, and in 1988, his penalty phase of the trial began, the time for jurors to decide if he should be sentenced to life without parole or death. They chose death.
What do you want people to understand about how this all affected your mom?
That there's more than one victim in it. And she loved that man. no matter what. And she stayed by him. She didn't believe it at all, no matter how hard I tried to convince her, and to the point where I said bad things, and none of it worked. That's love. She was in love with the man, and I don't understand. I tried to get her to stop, but it just wouldn't work. You can't make someone stop loving. My mom went approximately every 3 months. Once he got sentenced up there and finally got to San Quentin, about the first 5 years, it was every 3 months. She'd go up there and spend the night, but then it got expensive. And she just couldn't do it. And her health started failing, but I think the total was 14 times she saw him before she had to stop. She stayed home, she didn't go nowhere. She waited for phone calls, she waited for letters. And then to watch her suffer for the 12 years she suffered after that is really painful. I never even thought about forgiving him. In fact, I hate him more today than I did back then. Morro Bay. That was a picture of my mother and me. She was happy. She loved going to the beach and loved going camping. And I just called her over and took a picture, and God, she looked happy. I would consider myself a mama's boy. I took care of her, and she took care of me. I miss that woman. But that was in her time of happiness right there, just waiting to be shattered. I mean, I wrote him a letter there after my mom passed away. I poured my heart into it and told him he should have died a long time ago. It's just not right. I didn't deserve it. She didn't deserve it. The two girls' families didn't deserve it. And I didn't even think about any of this stuff until this, I tried to block it all out. And when my mom passed away, I thought I was done with that, That part of my life is gone and stuff like that. But guess what? It'll never leave. It'll never leave.
The vast, sweeping expanse of the Pacific Ocean carries with it an old and enduring silence, a stillness that surrounds the remote archipelagos where geography and tradition have long dictated the rhythm of daily life. For generations, the Samoan Islands, divided by geopolitical boundaries into the independent nation of Samoa and the unincorporated United States territory of American Samoa, have maintained an interconnected cultural fabric bound by bloodlines, shared history, and a deep reverence for intellectual and artistic expression. In these closely knit communities, where families are deeply rooted and prominent figures are known across every village and shoreline, a profound sense of insular security usually prevails, rendering the intrusion of extreme violence not merely shocking, but deeply destabilizing to the very foundation of the society. The year 2024 was meant to be another chapter in the ongoing preservation of this rich cultural heritage, a period where the region's most celebrated minds continued to shape the educational and literary landscape of the Pacific. Yet, in the quiet warmth of May 2024, the peaceful atmosphere of this isolated paradise was permanently shattered by an act of sudden, inexplicable brutality that took place within the walls of a sanctuary dedicated to the arts and creative expression. The news did not merely travel through the traditional channels of journalism. It rippled through the islands like a seismic shock, passing from household to household, from the coastal villages of Tutula to the academic corridors of Hawaii, leaving an entire population in a state of absolute disbelief and collective mourning. At the center of this tragedy were two individuals whose names were inextricably linked to the pride, intellect, and global representation of the Samoan people. The victim was Professor Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard, a foundational educator, a brilliant scholar, and a beloved mentor whose extensive career had left an indelible mark on the higher education systems of both American Samoa and Hawaii. Her life had been entirely dedicated to giving voice to the Pacific, to analyzing its complexities, and to nurturing generations of young thinkers who looked to her as a beacon of cultural integrity and academic excellence. To imagine her life ending in a sudden flash of uncontrolled rage was a concept that the public found completely impossible to reconcile with the quiet dignity she had projected throughout her decades of public service and instruction. Even more confounding and deeply disturbing to the community was the identity of the person who stood accused of committing this heinous act. The authorities quickly identified the perpetrator as Papaliaisia Figiel, a highly acclaimed contemporary novelist whose literary works had earned international recognition and had long been celebrated as a vital component of modern Pacific literature. Figiel was an artist who had spent her career exploring the human condition, the nuances of identity, and the struggles of her people through the written word, making her transition from a celebrated cultural storyteller to an accused murderer an agonizing paradox for the society that had championed her success. The setting of this horrific encounter was the Galamoana Theater, a space designed for artistic gathering, performance, and intellectual exchange, which in an instant transformed from a hall of creativity into a claustrophobic scene of unimaginable terror and fatal violence. What began as a localized tragedy within the creative circles of the islands quickly evolved into a massive, multi-jurisdictional crisis that completely exposed the fragile intersections of fame, family networks, and political power across the Samoan region. Because both the victim and the perpetrator possessed vast networks of influence stretching across the ocean, the shock waves of the murder crossed political borders, directly involving the legal, social, and political frameworks of both independent Samoa and American Samoa. The gravity of the crime itself was immense, but the public anxiety intensified dramatically as the months progressed, leading into a tumultuous 2025 where the narrative shifted from an isolated act of violence to a systemic scandal. The integrity of the entire regional justice system was called into question as serious allegations emerged, accusing high-ranking officials of utilizing their immense authority to deliberately intervene in the homicide investigation, attempting to alter the course of justice for a well-connected defendant. The anger of the public grew to a fever pitch as details began to surface regarding the active suppression and physical destruction of vital evidentiary items, most notably the personal electronic communication devices belonging to the deceased professor. The systematic deletion of data and the physical tampering with her mobile phone and tablet computer transformed the case from a clear-cut prosecution of a violent assault into a dark, sprawling narrative of institutional corruption and cover-ups that threatened to shield the killer from full accountability. For the people of Samoa and American Samoa, the case became a painful test of whether the rule of law could withstand the pressures of elitism and political favoritism, or if the memory of a revered scholar would be sacrificed to protect the reputation of a famous literary icon. As the details of the confrontation inside the theater began to crystallize through the initial police reports, the sheer physical horror of the attack left no doubt that what occurred in May 2024 was not a simple accident, but a relentless, uncontrolled outburst of homicidal rage that required a meticulous, unyielding pursuit of absolute truth. The deep sense of betrayal felt by the community was magnified by the realization that the very institutions trusted to protect the populace and preserve the sanctity of human life were being accused of actively working against the interests of justice. In a region where family lineage and political connections carry immense weight, the boundaries between official duty and personal loyalty began to blur, creating an environment of intense suspicion where every investigative step was scrutinized by a grieving public. The loss of Professor Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard was an irreplaceable wound to the academic world, But the unfolding scandal threatened to turn that wound into a permanent scar on the integrity of the region's judicial history. The story of the Galamoana Theater murder is a somber examination of how a single afternoon of uncontrolled fury can dismantle decades of cultural achievement, and how the subsequent struggle for transparency can expose the deepest vulnerabilities within a society's power structures. To truly understand the profound magnitude of the loss that reverberated across the Pacific in the aftermath of May 2024, one must first understand the towering legacy of the woman at the center of this tragedy. Professor Caroline Sinoviana-Gabbard was not merely an academic operating within the confined walls of a university classroom. She was a foundational pillar of Pacific scholarship, a cultural custodian whose life was a masterclass in the preservation and elevation of indigenous voices. Her identity was deeply intertwined with the educational landscapes of both American Samoa and Hawaii, two distinct regions connected by the vast ocean and a shared Polynesian heritage. In societies where oral traditions, historical narratives, and communal knowledge are treated with the utmost reverence, a scholar of her caliber is viewed as a matriarch of wisdom. She dedicated her extensive career to ensuring that the complex histories and contemporary realities of her people were documented, analyzed, and celebrated with the academic rigor they deserved. For decades, her presence in the academic corridors of Hawaii and the community centers of American Samoa served as a guiding light for countless students, researchers, and aspiring writers who sought to navigate the intersection of modern education and traditional identity. Her approach to education was universally described by those who knew her work as deeply empathetic and persistently nurturing. She viewed literature and cultural studies not as sterile subjects to be memorized, but as living, breathing extensions of the human soul. She spent her life championing the idea that the stories of the Pacific Islands were essential components of the global human narrative. As an educator, her influence stretched far beyond the grading of papers or the delivery of lectures. She was a mentor who possessed a rare, quiet strength, an ability to listen deeply and encourage young minds to find their own authentic voices amid the noise of a rapidly changing world. The respect she commanded was not born out of intimidation or strict authority, but out of a profound, unwavering commitment to the intellectual growth of her community. To speak her name in the academic circles of Honolulu, or Pago Pago, was to invoke a standard of excellence and cultural integrity that few could ever hope to match. She was the anchor for a rapidly expanding field of Pacific studies, a woman whose life's work was the very antithesis of violence, chaos, or destruction. In stark, almost cinematic contrast to the grounded, nurturing presence of Professor Caroline Sinoviana-Gabbard stood the figure of Papalii Sia-Figiel. If the professor was the steady anchor of Pacific academia, the novelist was the storm of its contemporary literature. Papalii Sia-Figiel was a highly acclaimed, deeply influential contemporary novelist whose literary works had violently shaken the traditional boundaries of island storytelling. She was widely celebrated for her raw, unfiltered explorations of identity, womanhood, and the generational traumas that often simmer beneath the idyllic surface of Pacific island life. Her prose was known to be sharp, evocative, and unapologetically bold, earning her international accolades and establishing her as a fearless voice in modern literature. For years, she had been idolized as a creative genius who dared to articulate the darkest, most uncomfortable truths of her society. Her success brought a different kind of spotlight to the region, one characterized by literary awards, global readership, and the intense, often overwhelming pressure that accompanies profound artistic fame. The existence of these two formidable women within the same cultural sphere was a testament to the rich, multifaceted nature of Samoan intellectual life. They occupied overlapping but distinct realms of influence. One was dedicated to the careful, methodical cultivation of knowledge and historical context, while the other was driven by the urgent, sometimes chaotic fire of creative expression. In a region with such a small, interconnected population, it was inevitable that the paths of the revered scholar and the celebrated novelist would intersect. They were both recognized as titans of their respective fields, women whose contributions were celebrated as points of immense regional pride. The community viewed them as complementary forces, two brilliant minds working in tandem to elevate the cultural standing of the Pacific on the world stage. There was no public anticipation of hostility, no forewarning that their shared dedication to the arts would eventually become the backdrop for an unimaginable catastrophe. The setting where this catastrophic convergence occurred was the Galamoana Theater, a location that adds a layer of profound poetic tragedy to the events that unfolded. Situated as a hub for artistic expression, the theater was fundamentally designed to be a sanctuary for creativity, a safe space where ideas could be exchanged, where performances could breathe life into ancient myths, and where the community could gather to celebrate the shared human experience. The architecture and atmosphere of the Galamoana Theater were imbued with the spirit of collaboration and cultural pride. It was a place characterized by the soft glow of stage lights, the echoing resonance of spoken word poetry, and the quiet murmur of intellectual discourse. The physical space itself was intended to represent the highest aspirations of the community, standing as a monument to the beauty of the arts and the importance of public dialogue. To the people who frequented its halls, the theater was the absolute last place on earth where one would expect to encounter a scene of visceral, unmitigated horror. As the month of May in the year 2024 settled over the islands, the atmosphere was, by all external accounts, entirely ordinary. The humid, tropical air carried the usual rhythms of daily life, and the Galamoana Theater continued its operations as a focal point for cultural engagement. It was within this environment of presumed safety and artistic endeavor that Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard and Papalii Sia Figil found themselves in the same physical space. The precise nature of their meeting that day, the underlying context of their interaction within the walls of the theater, was initially obscured by the horrifying violence that would soon follow. However, what remains undeniable is the immense weight of the legacy both women carried into that room. The space was filled not just with two individuals, but with decades of accumulated respect, profound cultural influence, and the unspoken pressures that accompany high-level intellectual achievement. There is an inherent vulnerability in spaces dedicated to the arts and academia. People enter these sanctuaries with their guards lowered, expecting debates of the mind rather than threats to the body. Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard, a woman who had dedicated her entire existence to fostering understanding and communication, would have had no reason to perceive the renowned novelist standing before her as a physical threat. The environment of the Galamoana Theater was one of mutual respect, a realm where disagreements were meant to be settled through discourse, through the careful selection of words, and through the mutual acknowledgement of shared humanity. The tragedy is exponentially magnified by this context. The victim was situated in an environment she loved, surrounded by the cultural elements she had spent her life protecting, engaging with a fellow intellectual who had similarly benefited from the nurturing embrace of the Samoan artistic community. The juxtaposition of the serene, creative environment against the brutal reality of the impending attack creates a chilling narrative paradox. Here was a distinguished elder, a scholar who had analyzed the darkest chapters of human history from the safety of academic objectivity, suddenly thrust into a nightmare of immediate, intimate violence. The transition from a space of elevated thought to a theater of primal aggression was absolute and devastating. The community's later struggle to comprehend the crime was deeply rooted in this dissonance. It was not merely the loss of a life that traumatized the public. It was the violation of a sacred cultural space, the desecration of a trusted sanctuary by someone who was fundamentally expected to understand its value. The novelist, whose career was built on the careful construction of narratives, was about to permanently destroy the real-life narrative of a beloved mentor. As we examine the portrait of Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard in the moments before the tragedy, we must focus on her enduring dignity. She represented the best of a society that values wisdom over force, community over ego, and education over ignorance. Her presence in the Gala Theater that fateful day was a continuation of her lifelong mission to engage, to listen, and to contribute to the cultural dialogue of her people. She stood as a testament to the enduring power of gentle strength, unaware that the intellectual sanctuary around her was about to become the epicenter of a brutal, uncontrollable frenzy. The sheer tragedy of her final moments is inseparable from the beautiful, constructive nature of the life she led. The community would soon be forced to grapple with the agonizing reality that an individual who had given so much life and light to the Pacific was violently extinguished in a place meant for illumination by hands that were previously celebrated for their creative genius. The stage was set, the legacy of the victim was firmly established, and the catastrophic collapse of reason was imminent. The deep sense of loss that would eventually envelop the region was directly proportional to the magnitude of Professor Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard's contributions. Her academic journey was not one of solitary pursuit. It was inherently collaborative and infinitely generous. She possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of Pacific traditions, yet she never wielded her intellect as a weapon or a tool of superiority. Instead, she used her vast understanding to build bridges between the older, more traditional generations and the younger, modern youth who often felt disconnected from their ancestral roots. Her lectures were described as transcendent experiences, where the rigid structures of Western academia were softened and enriched by the indigenous philosophies of the islands. She taught her students that their identities were not merely historical artifacts to be studied by outsiders, but vibrant, essential forces that deserved to be articulated with pride and clarity. This profound emotional connection she shared with her students and colleagues made her an irreplaceable figure, a maternal presence in a highly competitive intellectual world. When we consider the profile of Papalii Figiel alongside the professor, the tragedy deepens into a narrative of profound betrayal. Figiel's literary success was built upon the very cultural foundations that Professor Sinaviana-Gabbard had spent her life preserving. The novelist drew her inspiration from the complex social dynamics, the hidden struggles, and the unspoken tensions of Samoan life. Her books were celebrated because they possessed a visceral authenticity, a willingness to confront the shadows that lingered behind the sunlit imagery of the Pacific. Yet, in the aftermath of the event, this artistic fearlessness would be re-examined through a horrific new lens. The public would be forced to ask how an individual capable of such profound literary empathy, someone who could intricately weave the emotional struggles of marginalized voices into award-winning prose, could simultaneously harbor the capacity for such absolute, unthinking brutality. The dissonance between the creator and the killer became an inescapable torment for a community that had revered her words. The Gala Theater, standing silently as the backdrop to this impending doom, held its own silent vigil. The walls of the theater, adorned with the artistic expressions of the community, were completely indifferent to the status of the two women. It was a space that had witnessed countless performances, standing ovations, and impassioned speeches. It was designed to absorb the echoes of human emotion, to contain the boundless energy of artistic expression. But it was never intended to be a tomb. The transition of this cultural landmark from a beacon of regional pride to a permanent crime scene is a tragedy that extends beyond the loss of human life. It represents the shattering of a collective illusion, the sudden, violent realization that even the most sacred intellectual sanctuaries are not immune to the devastating unpredictability of human rage. The peaceful afternoon in May 2024 was the final moment of innocence for this cultural hub, the last breath of calm before an irreversible storm of violence tore through the fabric of the Samoan artistic community, leaving nothing but grief, confusion, and an overwhelming demand for justice in its wake. The atmosphere within the Gala Theater on that afternoon in May 2024 was initially marked by the customary quiet of a space dedicated to intellectual deliberation, a stillness that would soon be shattered by an escalation of events so sudden and extreme that it defied the logical expectations of those who were present. The interaction between Professor Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard and the novelist Papalii Sia Figiel, which began within the bounds of a routine cultural or academic engagement, rapidly devolved from a seemingly ordinary exchange into a volatile confrontation. While the underlying grievances or points of contention that triggered the initial dispute remained largely unknown to the broader public in the immediate aftermath, the transition from words to physical aggression occurred with a velocity that left no room for mediation or de-escalation. The theater, previously a bastion of refined discourse, became the enclosed arena for a sequence of events characterized by an absolute abandonment of restraint and a descent into the raw, primal violence that would ultimately claim the life of the professor. As the verbal altercation between the two women intensified, the internal dynamic of the room reached a breaking point, signaling the tragic expiration of their long-standing professional and social associations. The escalation was not merely an increase in volume or intensity of debate, but a fundamental rupture in the social contract that governs human interaction, particularly among individuals of such elevated standing. Witnesses to the unfolding horror would later struggle to articulate the exact moment when the intellectual boundaries were breached, as the transition into physical brutality happened with a fluidity that was as shocking as it was devastating. The novelist, whose professional life was defined by the sophisticated manipulation of language and the exploration of complex emotional landscapes, suddenly pivoted to a mode of interaction that was entirely devoid of nuance, rationality, or empathy. This shift represented the emergence of a destructive, uncontrollable rage that had evidently been festering beneath the surface of their relationship, waiting for the precise environmental trigger to manifest in the physical realm. The violence that erupted inside the Galamoana Theater was not a momentary lapse or a singular, uncalculated push. It was a sustained and relentless assault that demonstrated an overwhelming intent to cause catastrophic harm. As the dispute escalated, Papalii Sia Figiel seized upon an object within her immediate reach, a heavy and blunt implement that would transform the theater into a scene of carnage. The subsequent attack was described with chilling clarity in the forensic reports that would eventually emerge, detailing a series of repetitive, forceful strikes directed with singular focus toward the head of Professor Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard. There was a terrifying mechanical efficiency to the violence, a relentless cadence of impact that echoed throughout the theater's auditorium, marking the systematic destruction of a brilliant life. The professor, a woman whose life had been a testament to the power of the mind, was subjected to a physical force that was calculated to silence that mind forever, shattering the very vessel of her intellect with devastating finality. Each strike delivered by the attacker was a violent rejection of the societal norms, professional respect, and long-standing cultural bonds that should have, under any conceivable circumstance, precluded such an outcome. The brutality of the incident was not merely confined to the physical act of the assault itself, but was exacerbated by the intimate setting in which it occurred. The Galamoana Theater, a place where people gathered to witness the triumph of the human spirit through drama and art, was now forced to host the absolute antithesis of its purpose. The blunt object became the instrument of an irreversible tragedy, an extension of an internal fury that had no regard for the victim's contributions to their community or the profound loss her death would represent for the Pacific Islands. As the strikes continued, the professor's capacity to defend herself or escape was rapidly diminished, rendering the final moments of the encounter a lopsided, brutal affair that highlighted the total absence of mercy or hesitation on the part of the assailant. The medical evidence that would later detail the cause of death presented a grim and harrowing narrative of the final minutes of Professor Sinaviana-Gabbard's existence. The clinical findings identified massive, catastrophic trauma to the skull and brain, injuries that were entirely consistent with a high-velocity, repetitive blunt force assault. It was clear from the pathological data that the attacker had not aimed for anything less than the complete and permanent cessation of life. The traumatic brain injuries sustained by the victim were not the result of a single accidental fall or a generalized struggle. They were the consequence of focused, determined strikes that left no ambiguity regarding the murderous intent behind the outburst. The theater, usually a place of light and intellectual clarity, became a dark, claustrophobic chamber of blunt trauma, where the brilliant light of one of the Pacific's most important scholars was extinguished through an act of sheer, unadulterated aggression. In the immediate aftermath of the assault, the silence that returned to the Galamoana Theater was heavy, laden with the weight of the irrevocable crime that had just been committed. The attacker, having unleashed a level of violence that fundamentally altered the course of history for the region's intellectual community, found herself in a position that would fundamentally redefine her own identity from that of a celebrated author to that of a suspected perpetrator of a heinous crime. The scene inside the theater was a visual testament to the volatility of the event, with the discarded object used in the assault providing a damning narrative of the preceding minutes. The physical evidence remained frozen in the theater, a silent witness to the breakdown of reason and the catastrophic failure of the bonds of friendship and professional collegiality. As the authorities began their process of securing the scene and identifying the components of the tragedy, the sheer scale of the incident began to permeate the consciousness of those who would arrive to find the victim. The psychological impact of the incident on the few who witnessed the escalation or who discovered the aftermath cannot be understated. To witness a confrontation between two titans of the intellectual world evolve into such a savage, fatal encounter is to experience a traumatic shattering of reality. The inherent trust that members of the academic and artistic community placed in one another was obliterated in the blink of an eye. The tragedy at Galamoana was not a crime of passion born of mystery or misunderstanding. It was a manifestation of a deep-seated, uncontrollable rage that chose the most public and sacred of settings to express its devastating reach. The brutal simplicity of the act, a blunt object, an uncontrolled outburst, and the sudden cessation of a vibrant life, stands as a stark reminder of how thin the veneer of civilization can be, even among those who dedicate their lives to the cultivation of the human spirit. For the investigative teams that would eventually process the theater, the evidence painted a clear, uncompromising picture of what occurred that May afternoon. There were no hidden motives of grand political intrigue in the immediate violence itself, only the undeniable proof of a visceral, physical attack that left no question as to the identity of the assailant or the nature of the act. The focus of the authorities at this preliminary stage was purely on the mechanics of the murder, the sequence of the argument, the proximity of the weapon, and the unrelenting progression of the physical assault. The tragedy was marked by its lack of complexity in the act itself, standing in sharp contrast to the labyrinthine political scandal that would later threaten to obscure it. In that moment of violence, everything that Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard had achieved, all the wisdom she had imparted, and all the cultural bridges she had built were distilled into a single, agonizing reality of terminal injury. The theater, stripped of its artistic pretense, stood bare as the site of a brutal, unmitigated homicide that left the Pacific Islands reeling in the shock of a senseless, irreversible loss. The echoes of the impacts within that hall would continue to resonate long after the scene was cleared, serving as a permanent, haunting reminder of the day that intellectual collaboration was violently transformed into a legacy of sorrow and legal contention, setting the stage for the tumultuous and corrupt chapters that would follow in the subsequent year. The absolute finality of the physical trauma stood as the only truth in a situation that would soon be clouded by allegations of manipulation and systemic cover-ups, rendering the investigation into the act itself the only transparent moment in a case that was destined to become a defining controversy for the regional justice system. The immediate aftermath of the tragedy at the Galamoana Theater witnessed a swift and decisive police response, an effort characterized by the standard procedures of cordoning off the site and securing the physical evidence that would be necessary for a future prosecution. In the days following the murder of Professor Caroline Sinoviana-Gabbard, the initial investigation appeared to proceed along a linear and predictable path. The apprehension of Papalii Ciafigial was executed with promptness, and the basic forensic collection, ranging from the identification of the blunt instrument used in the assault to the documentation of the crime scene layout, seemed to support a straightforward legal trajectory. Investigators gathered physical artifacts, took initial statements from those present, and established a basic timeline that accounted for the escalation from argument to violence. However, as the calendar turned toward the following year, the perception of this investigation began to shift from one of diligent professional conduct to one of deep, pervasive suspicion. The transition from the year 2024 to 2025 marked the onset of a significant departure from standard procedural transparency, as the case began to draw the attention of high-level political interests. It was during this period of transition that the integrity of the evidence-gathering process became the subject of intense, growing public scrutiny. What had begun as an investigation into a violent homicide transformed into a sprawling scandal involving allegations of systemic interference by powerful, well-connected political figures. The most damning claims centered on the systematic disappearance and destruction of crucial digital evidence that was supposedly in the possession of the authorities. Central to these allegations was the fate of Professor Sinoviana-Gabbard's personal electronic devices, specifically her mobile phone and tablet computer. These items, which would have contained the most intimate details of her recent communications, her scheduling, and potentially the correspondence leading up to the final confrontation, vanished from the evidentiary chain of custody. The disappearance was not merely a case of misplaced files. It was widely interpreted by the public as a deliberate, calculated effort to excise information that could prove damaging to the interests of the defendant or her influential supporters. As the accusations of evidence tampering gained traction, the narrative shifted toward the role of high-ranking government officials who were alleged to have utilized their positions to shield the accused from the full weight of the law. The public indignation was ignited by reports suggesting that these officials had not only facilitated the destruction of the phone and tablet, but had also been involved in the permanent deletion of data that might have shed light on the deeper dynamics between the victim and the perpetrator. The allegation was that the justice system, usually intended to serve as the impartial arbiter of facts, had been compromised from within, turning the process into a political theater rather than a search for truth. This suspected interference struck at the very core of public trust, suggesting that in the island region, lineage and social proximity to power could effectively supersede the fundamental tenets of justice. The outrage among the community was not just a reaction to the original crime, but a profound sense of betrayal by the institutions tasked with ensuring that such a heinous act would not go unpunished. The process of tracing the missing evidence became a labyrinthine task for those outside the inner circle of political power, as every request for information was met with layers of bureaucratic obfuscation. The details of the destruction were particularly alarming. It was not merely the loss of the physical objects, but the reported synchronization of events that pointed toward a centralized attempt at concealment. The tablet and phone, which represented the most direct link to the professor's final thoughts and social interactions, were scrubbed clean or rendered permanently inaccessible, removing a vital piece of the prosecution's potential argument. This technical erasure was seen as an act of violence against the memory of the professor, as it effectively silenced her final digital voice and obscured the full context of the events that led to her death at the Galamoana Theater. The suspicion grew that the intervention was designed to protect the reputation of the novelist by preventing the public from ever knowing the true nature of the grievances that fueled the fatal argument. The investigative process, previously focused on the mechanics of a murder, was now forced to account for the activities of those who were theoretically meant to be the keepers of the evidence. The tension within the community reached a breaking point as the allegations of corruption permeated the media and the public discourse. Legal advocates for the victim's family began to raise pointed questions about the chain of custody, the lack of digital recovery attempts, and the suspicious absence of accountability for those who held access to the evidence room. The narrative of the investigation was no longer about the crime, but about the subsequent crime, the attempt to bury the truth and protect the perpetrator from the consequences of her actions. This secondary crisis caused an immeasurable amount of pain to the professor's family, who had already endured the shock of her death and were now forced to watch as the mechanisms of justice were allegedly being used to degrade her dignity and memory. Throughout the early months of 2025, the investigation became synonymous with the scandal of institutional obstruction. Every delay, every missing report, and every unexplained gap in the procedural record was viewed by the public as further evidence of a coordinated cover-up. The political environment, characterized by strong family networks and interlocked power structures, made it increasingly difficult to discern where official duty ended and personal interest began. The scrutiny turned toward the specific individuals within the government and the police department who possessed the authority to authorize the destruction of such sensitive materials. The accusations were not mere speculation. They were rooted in the stark reality that evidence of such monumental importance does not simply vanish unless it is intentionally moved, deleted, or destroyed by parties with direct access to the secure facilities. The node of this investigation, which started as a singular, tragic event at the theater, had effectively morphed into a systemic challenge to the regional government. The investigators who were tasked with finding the truth were now under fire for their role in the potential erasure of that truth. The contrast between the initial, seemingly clear apprehension of Papalii Figiel and the murky, suspicious behavior of the authorities in the months that followed created a deep fracture in the public's confidence. The community was no longer asking who killed Professor Sinavayana, but who was complicit in the aftermath of the killing. This question, left largely unanswered or met with silence by the relevant authorities, became the primary motivator for a wave of protests and social unrest across the islands. The case, once focused on a singular act of individual aggression, became a litmus test for the integrity of the entire judicial system. As we dissect the steps taken during this period of investigation, the absence of transparency becomes the most defining feature. The failure to account for the personal electronic devices is a failure of the state to protect the interests of the deceased, and in turn, a failure to honor the memory of a woman who had dedicated her life to the illumination of knowledge. The deliberate destruction of these items points to a fear of what they might reveal. A fear that what was stored on the mobile phone and tablet would contradict the version of events that the novelist and her defenders wished to present to the public. If the investigation had followed a path of absolute adherence to the law, the recovery of that digital evidence would have provided the definitive map of the final days and hours of the professor's life. Instead, the void left by their destruction has become a space where rumors, anger, and distrust have flourished, permanently damaging the prospect of a completely transparent trial. The investigation, once a search for objective reality, has become an exercise in fighting through layers of institutional secrecy, leaving the truth obscured, the family grieving, and the public demanding answers in a climate where those in power seem committed to preserving the status quo at the expense of justice. The unfolding scandal of 2025 remains a dark, indelible mark on the regional justice system, a reminder of how quickly the pursuit of justice can be derailed when the mechanisms of power are weaponized to serve the interests of the few. The legal proceedings against Papalii Figiel unfolded in an environment thick with anticipation and heavy with the pervasive scent of scandal, a courtroom atmosphere where the gravity of the murder charge was perpetually weighed against the chilling backdrop of the alleged institutional corruption. As the trial officially commenced, the presiding judge and the prosecution faced the gargantuan task of establishing the facts of the homicide while navigating the treacherous terrain created by the destruction of the victim's electronic evidence. The case presented in court was built upon the forensic realities identified at the Galamoana Theater. The medical reports documenting the horrific cranial injuries, the physical proximity of the suspect to the scene, and the testimony regarding the escalation of the confrontation. The prosecution focused its narrative on the sheer force of the assault, arguing that the repeated use of a blunt instrument against the head of Professor Caroline Sinoviana Gabbard was an act that lacked any semblance of defensive action or impulsive desperation, instead presenting it as a cold, determined effort to ensure the permanent loss of life. Each day of the trial served as a grim reminder of the brutality that had transpired, with expert witnesses providing testimony that meticulously reconstructed the final moments of the professor's life, painting a picture that was as difficult to digest as it was factually inescapable. The defense, led by legal counsel tasked with the difficult objective of representing a formerly venerated novelist, now cast as a murderer, attempted to characterize the incident through the lens of a psychological break, a momentary collapse of sanity induced by the environment of the theater and the intensity of the preceding argument. However, the forensic evidence regarding the duration and focus of the assault made this narrative a difficult sell to the jurors. The physical reality, the repetitive strikes, the choice of implement, and the precision with which the victim was neutralized spoke volumes in a way that the defense's rhetoric struggled to overcome. Throughout the sessions, the courtroom became a stage for the collision of two realities: the public's desire for an accounting of the brutal violence and the reality that the prosecution's case was fundamentally hampered by the missing tablet and phone. The defense frequently seized upon this evidentiary void, insinuating that the prosecution's inability to produce a comprehensive record of the victim's digital communications left too many questions unanswered, creating a narrative that the state was attempting to build a conviction on incomplete and potentially biased foundations. The trial was not merely a judgment of a single act of violence. It was in many respects a judgment of the society that had fostered both the victim and the perpetrator. The tension was palpable as the testimonies of witnesses who had seen the two intellectuals together shortly before the tragedy were brought into the record. Their accounts described a palpable change in the atmosphere, a shifting dynamic that signaled the end of professional collegiality and the beginning of a far more sinister interaction. When the forensic pathologist took the stand, the courtroom fell into a stunned, icy silence. The details of the traumatic brain injuries were articulated with clinical precision, and as the witness described the irreversible damage caused by each successive blow to the professor's head, it became clear that this was not a dispute that had spiraled out of control, but a calculated execution. The legal team representing the victim's family, observing the proceedings with a mixture of grief and resolve, emphasized the profound intellectual and cultural vacuum left by the professor's passing, urging the court to see beyond the fame of the defendant and focus squarely on the irreparable nature of the crime. As the legal proceedings moved into the presentation of the political fallout, the atmosphere in the courtroom became even more strained. The prosecution had to carefully navigate the allegations of evidence tampering without allowing the trial to devolve entirely into a case about the government's failures rather than the defendant's actions. Every mention of the missing electronics triggered audible reactions from the public gallery, highlighting the deep skepticism surrounding the investigative process. The judge was forced to repeatedly rein in the discourse, emphasizing that the focus remained on the criminal culpability of Figiel for the death of Sinoviana Gabbard. Yet, the specter of the cover-up remained an omnipresent force. The jurors were clearly aware of the outside pressure, the swirling rumors of high-ranking government interference, and the palpable anger of the community that filled the halls outside the courtroom doors. The defense's attempt to paint the investigation as inherently compromised was a strategic maneuver intended to sow doubt, effectively utilizing the government's own failures to construct a shadow of reasonable doubt that could be exploited during deliberations. The final days of the trial saw a stark divergence in the narratives presented to the court. The prosecution's closing argument centered on the permanence of the harm, the sanctity of the life lost, and the overwhelming forensic evidence that confirmed the intent to kill. They argued that regardless of the systemic failures that plagued the aftermath, the act itself was documented, undeniable, and unequivocally the work of the defendant. The defense, in turn, retreated into a narrative of tragedy, attempting to cast the novelist as a woman who had, in a singular, disastrous moment, been undone by the very intellect that had previously elevated her to fame. They implored the jury to consider the broader context of the relationship, the pressures of their roles, and the possibility that the events of May were the result of a profound internal collapse, rather than a predatory act of murder. It was a classic legal gamble, attempting to humanize an individual accused of an inhumane act, all while leveraging the cloud of suspicion surrounding the prosecution's missing evidence to create a pathway for acquittal or a lesser charge. When a verdict was finally reached, the silence that enveloped the courtroom was profound. The jury, having weighed the grim physical evidence against the backdrop of the political scandal, delivered a judgment that was meticulously awaited by the entire region. The verdict of the court did not provide the absolute closure that the community had been hoping for, as the lingering questions regarding the systematic destruction of the digital evidence continued to cast a long shadow. The conviction of Papalii Sia Figiel for the murder of Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard was an acknowledgement of the act itself, a judicial recognition that the violence of that May afternoon was a criminal offense of the highest order. However, the legal victory for the prosecution was bittersweet, tempered by the knowledge that the institutional corruption exposed during the trial remained largely unaddressed by the formal verdict. The court had held the novelist accountable, but it had not been the venue to hold the political actors accountable for the subsequent disappearance of the tablet and the mobile phone. The final judicial outcome represented a pivot point in the region's history. It was the moment that the legal system officially reconciled itself with the loss of its most respected scholar, but it also functioned as a testament to the lingering rot within the administrative structure. As the sentence was handed down, the public reaction was not one of celebration, but of profound, thoughtful solemnity. The tragedy had fundamentally altered the way the people of the Pacific Islands viewed their own institutions, turning their eyes from the theater stage to the corridors of power where decisions were made that could determine the fate of truth itself. The verdict confirmed that while the novelist would face the consequences for her actions, the deeper questions regarding the integrity of the regional government and the protection of evidence remained unanswered. The trial had concluded. The legal process had run its course, but the wound left by the murder and the subsequent cover-up remained raw, serving as a permanent reminder of the fragility of justice in a world where personal power and political alliances can threaten the transparency of the law. The courtroom cleared, the proceedings ended, but the narrative of the case continued to ripple outward, evolving from a courtroom drama into a broader cultural reckoning that would persist long after the verdict was entered into the formal record, cementing the Galamoana tragedy as a defining chapter in the collective memory of the Samoan people. The conclusion of the legal proceedings against Papalii Sia Figiel did not signal the end of the turmoil that had gripped the Samoan Islands. Rather, it marked the beginning of a long, painful period of societal introspection and cultural reckoning. The tragedy at the Galamoana Theater, which originated as a singular, violent act, had metastasized into a pervasive crisis of public trust that fundamentally altered the relationship between the people and their governing institutions. For the academic and literary communities, the loss of Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard remained a gaping, unfillable void. Her absence was not merely felt in the lecture halls of Hawaii or the cultural workshops of American Samoa. It was present in the silence of an intellectual discourse that had lost one of its most vital and nurturing voices. The academic world, which had relied on her to bridge the chasm between traditional heritage and modern education, was forced to carry on in a climate of diminished hope and heightened suspicion, perpetually haunted by the memory of how easily a life of such immense value could be discarded in a place meant for the celebration of the human spirit. In the months and years that followed the conviction, the Galamoana Theater became a symbol of a shattered innocence. It was no longer viewed as a sanctuary for art, but as a site of profound betrayal and systemic failure. The theater stood as a reminder of the fragility of the cultural space, a physical monument to the vulnerability of even the most respected members of society when confronted with the raw, unchecked aggression of a peer. The public indignation that had been ignited by the political scandal of 2025 did not dissipate with the verdict. Instead, it evolved into a permanent, hardened skepticism toward the authorities. The memory of the missing tablet and mobile phone, the deliberate, technical erasure of the victim's final voice, served as an enduring point of contention, a symbol of how the mechanisms of power could be weaponized to obscure the truth. This skepticism fostered a new generation of activists and observers who began to demand a level of transparency that the islands had previously not experienced, forcing the political elite to confront the reality that their actions were being watched, recorded, and judged by a community that was no longer willing to accept the status quo. The artistic and literary landscape of the Pacific Islands also underwent a profound transformation. The acclaim that had once been lavished upon Papaliaea Figil was irrevocably tainted by the knowledge of her role in the professor's murder. The literature that had once been celebrated as a bold, authentic representation of Samoan identity was now read through a tragic and distorted prism, forcing readers to reconcile the creative brilliance on the page with the horrifying violence that had manifested in the theater. This forced reconciliation led to an agonizing debate within the cultural community regarding the separation of art from the artist. Could the written work still be valued, or was it forever compromised by the actions of its author? There were no easy answers to these questions, and the resulting discourse served only to deepen the communal grief. The once unified narrative of Pacific cultural pride had been fractured, leaving the intellectuals to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that their own circles of brilliance were just as susceptible to the darkest impulses of humanity as any other group. The political fallout, meanwhile, left behind a landscape characterized by lingering resentment and unresolved questions. The high-ranking officials accused of tampering with evidence remained largely protected by their positions and the complexity of the bureaucratic structures they operated within, which left the public feeling a profound sense of helplessness. The scandal served as a stark, sobering lesson on the limitations of justice in an environment where familial and social ties were deeply entrenched in the machinery of government. The demand for accountability that had characterized the months leading up to the trial became a persistent, low-level hum of dissent that continued to echo in the local media and in the private conversations of the populace. The failure to address the core of the political interference ensured that the case of Professor Sinaviana Gabbard would not simply be relegated to the history books, but would continue to act as a benchmark for political corruption and a rallying point for those who fought for a more transparent future. Reflecting on the totality of the tragedy, one must return to the immense, irreplaceable loss of the victim herself. Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard was an individual whose entire professional and personal life was dedicated to the principle that there is a better way for humans to interact, a way based on understanding, communication, and the nurturing of potential. Her death, brought about by an act of absolute, unthinking brutality, was a profound contradiction to everything she stood for. The tragedy was not just the act itself, but the way that the subsequent events seemed to validate the very cynicism she had spent her life fighting. The attempt to hide her digital life, to delete the records of her final interactions, was a final, desperate act of disrespect toward a woman who had spent decades ensuring that the voices of her people were heard and preserved. The community's continued demand for truth, despite the obfuscation of the political establishment, was, in itself, a tribute to her legacy, an attempt to uphold the values of honesty and intellectual integrity that she had championed until the very end. The case also serves as a haunting examination of the concept of the intellectual sanctuary. In a region that places such a high premium on the sanctity of community, family, and the arts, the violence at the Galamoana Theater represented a violation of the most fundamental tenets of social life. It forced the residents of Samoa and American Samoa to confront the reality that no space is truly safe from the unpredictable nature of human emotion, and that no level of professional or creative success provides an immunity from the dark impulses of the human heart. The ongoing reflection on the tragedy has become a necessary, if painful, component of the region's evolution. It has prompted a slow, incremental shift toward greater oversight and a heightened awareness of the risks of concentrated political power. The trauma of the event, while immense, has acted as a catalyst for a more cautious, guarded, and vigilant society, one that is no longer willing to take for granted the integrity of the figures they revere. As time moves forward, the memory of Professor Caroline Cinevanna Gabbard will continue to be honored in the institution she graced, but the story of her death will remain a dark, defining narrative of the Pacific. It is a story that defies easy categorization. It is a crime story, yes, but it is also a story of political failure, of the fragility of cultural identity, and of the enduring struggle for truth in a world that often prefers comfortable lies. For those who were close to the professor, the grief will always be present, an unchanging constant in a landscape that had been irrevocably altered. For the broader public, the legacy of the case is the realization that the pursuit of justice is not a singular event that culminates in a courtroom verdict, but a continuous, difficult, and often frustrating process that requires the constant attention and commitment of the citizenry. The Gala tragedy stands as a sobering testament to the fact that when we lose our most brilliant minds, we lose much more than just the individuals. We lose the light they brought to the world, and we are left to navigate the remaining shadows as best we can. In the final analysis, the story of this murder and the subsequent cover-up is a cautionary tale that resonates far beyond the shores of the Samoan Islands. It touches upon universal themes of power, integrity, the corruption of truth, and the profound, lingering impact of senseless violence. It reminds us that our institutions are only as strong as our collective willingness to hold them to account, and that the memory of the deceased can only be properly honored when we are brave enough to confront the realities of how they were taken from us. The tragedy at the theater is a somber, permanent fixture in the collective conscience, a narrative that refuses to be suppressed by the weight of time or the intervention of political actors. It is a story that, in the end, belongs not to the killer or the corrupt officials, but to the memory of the educator who taught her people that truth, no matter how obscured, must always be sought. The quiet dignity of Professor Cinevanna Gabbard's life continues to cast a long shadow over the theater, challenging those who remain to ensure that the pursuit of justice for her is never fully abandoned, and that the cultural and intellectual heritage she built is protected for the corrosive forces that once sought to silence her voice. The cycle of grief and reflection continues, a testament to a life that continues to influence the community, even in the cold, hard aftermath of its tragic, violent conclusion. The enduring echoes of the Gala tragedy have permeated the cultural consciousness of the Pacific in ways that transcend the immediate legal and political repercussions of the event. As we look back from the vantage point of the present, the death of Professor Caroline Cinevanna Gabbard serves as a somber lens through which the community views the shifting dynamics of power, celebrity, and accountability. It is a narrative that has refused to settle, becoming woven into the oral history of the islands as a cautionary tale about the perils of unchecked authority and the fragility of the intellectual foundations upon which the region's identity is built. The aftermath of the murder was not a singular moment of closure, but a catalyst for a sustained, generational debate regarding what it means to uphold the rule of law in a society where personal and familial connections have traditionally held significant sway over the application of justice. This debate has manifested in the emergence of new grassroots organizations, a more vigilant local press, and an increased public demand for the digitization of court records and the independent auditing of evidentiary chains of custody, all of which are direct reactions to the perceived failures of the 2025 investigation. The shadow cast by the destruction of the professor's electronic devices remains perhaps the most potent symbol of the entire ordeal. In a modern world where our digital footprints are often the most accurate mirrors of our lived experiences, the decision to erase those footprints was an act of profound suppression, a calculated strike against the ability to know the truth. For the families of both the victim and the accused, This act of deletion created a permanent historical void, an absence of context that allows for the proliferation of speculation and the hardening of factional lines. The fact that this void was created within the sanctuary of a government-controlled evidence locker continues to be a point of deep, lingering resentment among the populace. It has forced the community to reckon with the uncomfortable possibility that the institutions they once held in high regard could be capable of such blatant disregard for the sanctity of the truth, forever altering the psychological distance between the governing and the governed. Furthermore, the impact of the case on the regional literary and artistic community has proven to be transformative. The Galamoana Theater, while continuing to serve as a venue, now carries a weight that is inescapable for those who perform within its walls. There's a perceptible change in the way art is created and consumed in the islands. There's a greater emphasis on the responsibility of the artist and a more critical eye toward the cult of celebrity that can sometimes shield prominent figures from the consequences of their actions. The literary works produced in the region today are increasingly characterized by a consciousness of this tragedy, with a new generation of writers grappling with the legacy of their predecessors and the stark reality of how quickly brilliance can be turned toward destruction. The tragedy has forced a recalibration of the relationship between the public and its idols, fostering a culture of healthy skepticism that prioritizes the collective integrity of the society over the pedestalization of individual creative genius. In the academic sphere, the legacy of Professor Sinavana Gabbard is maintained through the continued work of her students and the scholars who are influenced by her methodology. The pain of her loss is channeled into a renewed commitment to the preservation of Pacific studies, ensuring that her intellectual contributions are not only remembered, but actively utilized as the framework for future research. However, this academic resilience is always accompanied by the haunting awareness of the abruptness with which her trajectory was halted. Her death is frequently cited in current seminars not just as a tragedy to be mourned, but as a case study in the vulnerability of truth and the necessity of academic vigilance. The loss of a voice as distinct as hers serves as an ongoing motivation for those who follow in her footsteps to advocate for the protection of independent thought and the critical assessment of historical narratives, even when such efforts are met with systemic resistance. The persistence of this narrative in the public discourse is also a testament to the fact that the story of the Galamoana Theater has moved beyond the borders of the Samoan Islands. It has become a reference point in international dialogues regarding the unique challenges faced by small, insular jurisdictions in maintaining judicial transparency and the rule of law. The questions raised by the case, how to prevent the interference of influential families in homicide investigations, how to guarantee the integrity of electronic evidence in remote regions, and how to balance the demands of cultural preservation with the requirements of the legal system, are universal concerns that gain a particular sharpness when viewed through the tragic prism of this murder. The lessons learned from the failures documented in 2025 have provided a blueprint for institutional reform that is being discussed in academic and legal circles far beyond the Pacific, proving that even a tragedy as contained as this one can hold profound implications for the global understanding of justice. As we consider the trajectory of this entire chronicle, from the serene afternoon in May 2024 to the complex political and judicial aftermath, we are compelled to acknowledge the resilience of the community in the face of persistent obstruction. The fact that the story has been preserved, scrutinized, and debated by the public despite the efforts to obscure it is perhaps the most significant victory of the entire ordeal. It signifies a refusal to allow the memory of Professor Sinavana Gabbard to be erased, both figuratively and literally. The collective insistence on holding onto the facts, on questioning the narrative provided by those in power, and on demanding a full accounting of the institutional failures has become a form of resistance that honors the victim's lifelong dedication to the pursuit of knowledge. It is a recognition that the truth is a living entity, one that requires constant vigilance and the willingness to face uncomfortable realities, even when they are buried beneath layers of political self-preservation. The final chapter of this tragedy is still being written in the ongoing efforts of the local citizenry to implement safeguards against the kind of systemic corruption that allowed the Galamoana cover-up to occur. There is an active movement toward the professionalization of the police forces, the introduction of independent civilian oversight boards, and the establishment of transparent protocol for the handling of sensitive digital evidence. These are the tangible responses to the intangible hurt that the community has endured. They represent a commitment to ensure that the circumstances which allowed the professor's life to be stolen and the truth of that act to be endangered are never allowed to manifest again. The tragedy at the theater, while irredeemable in its immediate horror, has served as the catalyst for a systemic evolution that aims to strengthen the societal fabric, making the islands a more accountable and transparent place for future generations to live and thrive. Ultimately, the story of Professor Caroline Sinavanagabbard, Papalii Sia Figiel, and the scandal at the Galamoana Theater is a meditation on the human capacity for both profound creation and senseless destruction. It challenges us to look beyond the surface of high-profile crimes and interrogate the systems that surround them, asking not just what happened, but why the mechanisms of justice were allowed to stutter at such a crucial moment. It is a story that refuses to provide the comfort of a simple resolution, instead leaving us with the enduring task of active, engaged citizenship. The professor's intellectual legacy remains, the novelist's work is forever shadowed, and the theater continues to stand as a silent observer to the history that occurred within it. The case continues to haunt, to provoke, and to educate, reminding all who engage with its details that the pursuit of truth is the most fundamental requirement of a free and just society. As the islands continue to heal, they do so with a deeper understanding of the fragility of their institutions and a stronger resolve to protect the integrity of their future, ensuring that the light of the professor's life continues to illuminate the path forward, even amidst the lingering shadows of that devastating May afternoon. The narrative of the Galamoana Theater remains open, a testament to a loss that will never be forgotten and a struggle for accountability that will never cease, as long as there are those who remember the woman who lived for the truth. The conclusion of this chronicle brings us to a somber reflection on the nature of history itself, how it is written, how it is obscured, and how it is ultimately reclaimed by those who refuse to forget. In the years following the conviction of Papalii Sia Figiel, the collective memory of the Samoan Islands has transformed the murder of Professor Caroline Sinavanagabbard from a contemporary news cycle event into a permanent fixture of the regional moral landscape. It serves as an inescapable touchstone for discussions regarding ethics, the responsibilities of the intellectual class, and the inherent dangers of unchecked power. The theater, once a symbol of artistic aspiration, now carries a quiet, heavy authority that forces every visitor to confront the duality of their society, a place capable of breathtaking cultural beauty and simultaneously susceptible to the most primal expressions of human rage and institutional indifference. The narrative that we have constructed through this investigation, from the serenity of the pre-incident days to the complex, systemic failures of the subsequent year, is not merely a recounting of facts. It is an examination of how a single life, when extinguished through violence and then buried through corruption, can eventually act as a foundational element for a renewed pursuit of societal transparency. The resilience of the truth, even when faced with the coordinated efforts of those in power to dismantle it, remains the most profound takeaway from this entire endeavor. The destruction of the professor's digital world, the scrubbing of the tablet, and the erasure of the mobile phone was intended to serve as the final word on the matter, a way to ensure that the secrets leading up to the final confrontation would remain locked away forever. Yet, in the years that followed, this very act of suppression became the primary catalyst for the public's enduring distrust. The void created by the missing evidence functioned as an active, living presence in the public consciousness, a silence that became louder than any official report or court-sanctioned narrative. It taught the citizens of the islands that when authority attempts to erase the past, it inadvertently draws more attention to the hidden reality, ensuring that the legacy of the victim is not silenced, but rather amplified by the very people who sought to diminish it. This dynamic of resistance, of a community steadfastly refusing to accept a sanitized or incomplete history, is the ultimate testament to the enduring impact of the professor's lifelong teachings. As we consider the broader implications of this case, we are reminded that no society is exempt from the tests of integrity that appear in the form of high-profile violence and political instability. The tragedy at the Gala Theater is a mirror held up to every small, interconnected community that relies on the strength of its social bonds to maintain order. It demonstrates how quickly those bonds can fray when personal allegiances are prioritized over the cold, objective requirements of the law. The ongoing evolution of the regional justice system, characterized by the slow, difficult process of implementing oversight and demanding transparency, is the necessary response to this realization. It is an acknowledgement that the protections we take for granted, the sanctity of the evidence room, the independence of the judicial process, and the protection of the victim's right to be heard, are not inherent guarantees, but are instead fragile constructs that must be defended every single day against the pressures of nepotism, fame, and political expediency. The legacy of the professor's life is therefore not just the body of academic work she left behind, but the systemic changes that her death has forced upon the institutions that ultimately failed to protect her. In the quiet moments of reflection that now define the community's engagement with this tragedy, there is a perceptible shift toward a more guarded, cynical, yet ultimately more engaged form of civic life. The innocence of the past, where trust in the regional government was largely implicit, has been replaced by an active, searching curiosity about the true mechanisms of local power. This is not a transition that has been made without cost. The pain and the trauma remain ever present, particularly for those who were closest to the professor. Yet, there is a certain strength to be found in this newfound awareness, a collective maturity that recognizes the reality of the shadows that lurk behind the sunlit veneer of island life. By engaging with the uncomfortable truths of the 2024 incident, the community has demonstrated that it is no longer willing to hide from the reality of its own vulnerabilities. It has chosen to stand in the light of the truth, regardless of how painful or damaging that light may prove to be. And in doing so, it has reclaimed the narrative of the professor's life from those who sought to distort it. The artistic and cultural community, deeply affected by the revelation of the novelist's involvement, has also moved toward a new equilibrium. The debate over how to balance the appreciation of creative genius with the moral realities of individual behavior continues, but it is now conducted with a newfound depth and nuance. The theater itself, having hosted such a pivotal and devastating event, has become a space where this ongoing process of reconciliation takes place. It is a place that reminds its patrons that art is a serious, consequential endeavor, one that demands the highest levels of integrity from its practitioners. The tragedy has effectively purged the artistic community of its own complacency, forcing a recalibration of the values that guide its cultural production. This, too, can be seen as an extension of the professor's influence. Her commitment to intellectual rigor and moral clarity has become the standard against which all future artistic and academic efforts in the region will be measured, ensuring that the void created by her absence is filled by a renewed, uncompromising dedication to the principles she championed. Finally, we must acknowledge the role of the future, the generation that will look back upon the Gala tragedy as a foundational moment in the political and judicial development of their home. For them, the events of 2024 and 2025 will serve as a stark reminder of the cost of indifference. The ongoing discussions and the persistent investigative efforts that continue to this day ensure that the story of the professor, the novelist, and the theater will be passed down, not as a myth, but as a grounded, factual, and essential piece of the region's history. It is a story that requires an active, participant listener, one who understands that justice is not merely a destination reached by a courtroom verdict, but an ongoing process of scrutiny and accountability. The professor's name will continue to be synonymous with the Pacific's intellectual awakening, and the tragedy of her passing will continue to fuel the fires of those who believe in the necessity of a transparent and equitable society. The light that she brought to the world was not extinguished. It was redirected into the struggle for truth that now defines the path forward for those she left behind. The finality of the tragedy is absolute, but the narrative it has spawned is infinite, constantly evolving as new questions are asked and new layers of the cover-up are exposed. It is a story that has transcended the physical boundaries of the theater and the political borders of the islands, reaching out to touch the conscience of anyone who believes that the integrity of the truth is the most fundamental requirement of a free and just world. The memory of the professor remains, an anchor in a turbulent sea of speculation and institutional obfuscation, guiding those who seek to navigate the remaining shadows toward the light of a better, more accountable future. The theater holds its vigil. The academic papers are still read, and the quest for a more perfect justice continues. A testament to a life that mattered, a death that shook the foundations of power, and a community that, in the face of insurmountable odds, refused to be silenced, choosing instead to carry the torch of the professor's wisdom forward, forever illuminated by the enduring, unyielding pursuit of the truth that defines the humanity she so dearly loved and protected through her work. This is the conclusion of our narrative, but it is merely the latest chapter in the history of a people who have learned that their greatest strength lies not in the authority of their leaders, but in their own collective, unwavering demand for the truth. As the final ripples of the Galamoana tragedy settle into the sediment of regional history, we are left to ponder the ultimate cost of such a profound violation of both the intellectual sanctuary and the civic trust. The story of Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard, though framed by the brutal, blunt force reality of her murder and the labyrinthine, corrupt aftermath of the investigation, serves as a testament to the inescapable nature of truth, even when it is buried under the heavy weight of political influence and institutional betrayal. We have traversed the arc of this event from the shocking intrusion of violence into a space dedicated to the arts, through the cold, procedural decay of the evidence-gathering process, to the eventual, bittersweet judicial reckoning that left so many systemic questions unanswered. This journey has not been one of easy resolution, but rather an arduous descent into the darker facets of small community governance, where the closeness of kinship often conflicts with the cold, impersonal demands of the law. Yet, in this descent, we have found that the resilience of the community's collective memory has acted as the only reliable safeguard against the total obfuscation of the facts, proving that the pen and the voice of the educator continue to hold sway long after the physical vessel has been destroyed. The institutional legacy of the Galamoana incident is now being written in the slow, painstaking language of reform. The realization that the justice system could be so easily compromised by the actions of a few well-positioned actors has sparked a realization across the Pacific Islands that the maintenance of democracy and the rule of law is not a passive exercise, but an active, daily responsibility. The tragedy has forced a maturation of the civic consciousness, moving it away from the reliance on the perceived integrity of individual officials toward the implementation of systemic checks and balances that are independent of personal alliances. The memory of the missing digital evidence, that haunting absence of the professor's final communications, has become the rallying cry for a new era of transparency. It is a constant reminder that when the state fails to protect the integrity of the evidence, it fails to protect the memory of the victim, and by extension, it fails to serve the community. This lesson has been absorbed into the very fabric of the island's political discourse, ensuring that the question of who guards the guardians remains at the forefront of the public agenda. In looking back at the life of Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard, we must recognize that her greatest contribution was not merely the academic work she produced or the students she mentored, but the environment of intellectual courage she fostered. By creating a space where the complexities of Pacific identity could be examined with rigorous honesty, she unintentionally prepared her community to confront the very tragedy that would claim her life. Her life was an exercise in the pursuit of truth, and it is entirely fitting that her death has become the catalyst for that same pursuit on a societal scale. The community's refusal to accept the silence imposed upon her digital presence is, in essence, the continuation of her work. They are using the tools she provided, the critical mind, the appreciation for historical context, and the unwavering commitment to the dignity of the individual to dismantle the narrative of corruption that sought to define the final chapter of her life. In this sense, the novelist who hoped to extinguish her influence through violence has only served to solidify it, turning a brilliant, localized career into a regional touchstone for moral and political integrity. The theater itself, while continuing to operate, remains a living participant in this ongoing process of cultural healing. Its walls have become the silent keepers of a memory that refuses to fade, a space that now requires a different kind of reverence from those who enter. It is no longer possible to participate in the arts within its halls without the ghost of that May afternoon acting as an unspoken guest. This is a necessary weight. It ensures that the gravity of what occurred is never lost to the trivialities of current events or the fading of time. It acts as a guardian against the creeping normalcy that often follows even the most horrific of crimes, preventing the society from forgetting the cost of their negligence or the fragility of their protections. The theater stands as a monument to the fact that cultural brilliance and human depravity can coexist in the same geography, serving as a reminder that we are responsible for the spaces we build and the environments we cultivate for our leaders, our artists, and our intellectuals. As we bring this account to a close, we must acknowledge the finality of the tragedy for the victim's family and those who knew her as a mentor and friend. For them, the closure of the trial and the subsequent public discourse is likely insufficient, a formal recognition of the event that does little to fill the personal void left by her passing. The grief that follows such a loss is a private journey, one that continues long after the public interest in the case has waned. Yet, even in their private sorrow, there must be a sense of profound irony in the way the world has responded. The woman who dedicated her life to the illumination of her culture has, in death, illuminated the darkest recesses of that same culture's administrative structure. Her legacy is no longer just her literature or her academic influence. It is now inextricably linked to the struggle for a more just society. She has become, in the eyes of the public, the silent protagonist of a struggle that is far larger than the individual, a representative of the collective demand for a truth that is not subject to the manipulations of power. The path forward for the islands is one of continued vigilance and persistent reform. The lessons of the Galamoana tragedy have not been fully learned until they are translated into the permanent, structural changes that prevent such systemic failures from recurring. The path is narrow and fraught with the obstacles of tradition, political patronage, and a natural human desire to move on from uncomfortable histories. However, the determination shown by the community in the face of the cover-up suggests that there is a newfound maturity in their approach to civic life. They have learned to look past the official press releases, to question the absence of documentation, and to recognize that the strength of their future depends on their ability to face the reality of their past, no matter how damaging or embarrassing that reality may be. The process of building a transparent society is, by definition, a long and demanding one, but it is the only one that truly honors the memory of those who were stolen by violence and hidden by corruption. In the final estimation, the tragedy at the Galamoana Theater is a story that refuses to be simplified or silenced. It is a complex, multi-layered drama that encapsulates the best and the worst of the human experience. It forces us to acknowledge our capacity for immense creativity and intellectual generosity, while simultaneously holding up a mirror to our susceptibility to greed, tribalism, and the corrupting influence of unchecked authority. It is a story that, in the end, belongs to everyone who values the truth above the comfortable protection of the status quo. The memory of Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard continues to resonate across the Pacific, a quiet, insistent reminder that the pursuit of justice is not a luxury, but a fundamental requirement of a life lived with integrity. As long as her story is told, as long as the questions surrounding her death remain a part of the public dialogue, the truth has not been defeated. It has been transformed into a mission, one that the community will carry forward as they navigate the complexities of their future, forever mindful of the day the light was darkened in the heart of the theater, and forever committed to ensuring that such a tragedy is never repeated. The cycle of history turns, but the truth remains, waiting to be reclaimed by those who are brave enough to seek it. And in that persistence, we find the only true justice that can ever be extracted from such a profound and irrevocable loss. The conclusion of our long inquiry into the tragedy at the Gala Theater inevitably leads us to a broader meditation on the nature of light and shadow within the context of Pacific history. As we draw the final curtain on this account, we are reminded that the story of Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard is not merely a chronicle of a murder, but a poignant reflection on the enduring tension between the sanctity of human intellect and the brutal reality of political decay. Throughout this investigation, we have scrutinized the mechanisms of power that sought to obscure the truth, and we have witnessed the indomitable spirit of a community that refused to let that truth vanish into the archives of convenience. The tragedy, which began as a solitary act of violence in the quietude of a May afternoon, evolved into a sprawling testament to the necessity of accountability, demonstrating that even in the most remote or insular regions, the principles of justice and transparency are the essential foundations upon which a society must stand if it wishes to survive the inevitable storms of human imperfection. The loss of the professor remains an open wound, yet the scar that is formed in the collective memory of the islands is one that provides both structure and a renewed sense of purpose. In reflecting on the trajectory of this entire ordeal, from the initial shock of the crime to the protracted legal and political fallout, we are compelled to acknowledge the role of the observer, the public, the student, the citizen, in ensuring that such events do not fade into the background of indifference. The Gala Theater, which once stood as a monument to cultural expression, has been permanently altered by the weight of the events it witnessed, but has also gained a new form of significance. It is no longer just a venue for the arts. It is a permanent reminder of the fragility of truth and the extreme measures that are sometimes necessary to defend it against the encroaching darkness of corruption. The story we have traced serves as an enduring guide for future generations, illustrating that the preservation of history is not an act of nostalgia, but an act of courage. It requires the willingness to challenge the narratives provided by those in power and the commitment to listen to the silences where evidence has been removed. This vigilant engagement with the past is the only mechanism through which the present can be corrected and the future can be secured against the repetition of such profound failures. The impact of this case on the legal landscape of the Samoan Islands provides a compelling study in the evolution of civic ethics. The subsequent reforms, driven by the public's refusal to accept the destruction of the professor's digital legacy, have set a new standard for how evidentiary chains of custody and the rights of the deceased are treated within the region's legal framework. This movement toward institutional accountability is a direct lineage of the protest that followed the revelation of the evidence tampering. It highlights the power of a single, focused demand for truth to overcome the inertia of established political practices. The institutional changes that have followed are not just bureaucratic updates. They're the result of a communal awakening that recognized the dangers of allowing private influence to bleed into the machinery of justice. In this light, the tragedy of 2024 has become a cornerstone of the regional movement toward greater transparency, providing the intellectual and political momentum necessary to challenge the status quo and build a society that is more resilient to the corrupting influence of unchecked authority. The personal resonance of the case continues to be felt in the quiet, private corners of the community where the professor's influence remains active and potent. For the students who continue to read her work, and for the peers who continue to build upon her academic foundations, The quest for truth is not just an abstract principle, but a deeply personal honor code. They are the keepers of her intellectual estate, and they're the ones who have ensured that her life and the circumstances of her death have not been reduced to a simple statistic or a forgotten grievance. Their work, conducted in the light of the integrity she preached, is the ultimate defiance against the shadow that sought to engulf her during the final moments in the theater. By sustaining the dialogue around her contributions and the necessity of justice for her passing, they have managed to transform the narrative from one of loss to one of ongoing resistance, a testament to the fact that her influence has proven far more durable than the reach of the violence that attempted to terminate it. As we reach the conclusion of this extensive examination, we must contemplate the nature of the truth itself, how it exists independently of our ability to document or prove it, and how it persists in the collective conscience of a people who have suffered the indignity of its concealment. The truth of what occurred in the Galmoana Theater in May 2024 is not limited to the contents of the deleted phone or the broken tablet. It is also contained in the reaction of the community to that erasure. It is in the frustration of the grieving, the persistence of the investigators who were ignored, and the unwavering demand for a clear accounting from those who were supposed to serve. The totality of the experience, both the crime and the subsequent scandal, provides a comprehensive lesson on the value of integrity and the high price that is often paid to uphold it in the face of insurmountable odds. The narrative of the professor's life and death is a profound, albeit painful, contribution to the global dialogue on the nature of justice, serving as a reminder that the pursuit of truth is a task that never truly ends, but instead shifts its focus from the discovery of facts to the defense of those facts against the erosive influence of time and corruption. The final legacy of this case will not be the conviction of the novelist, nor the exposure of the political actors who facilitated the cover-up, but the shift in the collective consciousness of the islands. It is the realization that the power to define the truth rests not with the government, the press, or the elite, but with the people who continue to demand that the light of inquiry be focused on the darkest aspects of their own society. The Galmoana tragedy has become a permanent feature of this regional maturity, providing a foundational myth of sorts, a story of loss and betrayal, but also a story of resilience and the unyielding nature of the truth. It is a story that, in the end, reinforces the dignity of the human person and the necessity of social order that respects the sanctity of the truth above all else. In the final estimation, the life of Professor Caroline Sinaviana Gabbard was one of illumination, and her death has ensured that that illumination continues to shine upon the paths of those who choose to live with courage, clarity, and an uncompromising commitment to the justice she so dearly embodied. In this spirit, we conclude our analysis, fully aware that while our narrative ends here, the real-world implications of the Galmoana case will continue to unfold as the islands evolve and grow. The story stands as a complete record of a time of great upheaval, a testament to the capacity of small, interconnected society to confront its own shadows and emerge with a renewed, more profound understanding of the essential requirements of a free and fair community. The theater continues its work, the academic discourse carries on, and the islands move toward a future that is forever marked by the lessons of that fateful May, ensuring that the legacy of the truth seeker who was taken from them is permanently etched into the history of the region. The tragedy is resolved in the historical sense, yet the mission to protect the truth remains, a constant and sacred duty for all who remember the brilliance of the professor and the necessity of keeping her voice and her story alive in the heart of the Pacific. This has been a long journey through the history of a profound loss, but it is one that ultimately serves to clarify the importance of the principles that allow us to live together in a world that is always and forever prone to the darkening influence of secrecy, deceit, and the unbridled use of power. We leave this case with the understanding that while we may not always reach the full clarity of an untainted truth, the pursuit of that clarity is itself the greatest measure of our humanity, a mission that the professor herself would have undoubtedly encouraged, and one that we must all continue to uphold in the face of whatever shadows may come next. for the story does not truly end until the truth has been spoken in its entirety. As we step beyond the formal closure of our investigation into the Galmoana Theater tragedy, we find ourselves standing at the confluence of memory, justice, and the perpetual evolution of the Samoan island social fabric. The final chapters of this narrative have revealed a landscape forever altered by the brutal collision of fame, intellect, and institutional corruption. Yet there remains a profound, unspoken necessity to distill the essence of what this entire ordeal truly signifies for the future of the Pacific. If the murder of Professor Caroline Sinaviana-Gabbard was the initial fracture, and the subsequent scandal of the missing evidence was the widening of that fissure, then the current era represents a fragile, determined attempt at mending. It is a process that requires more than just the passage of time. It demands a radical honesty regarding the vulnerabilities inherent in a society where the boundaries between the private influence of the elite and the public mandate of the state are often blurred by the weight of tradition and the gravity of familial loyalty. The tragedy has effectively stripped away the thin veneer of perceived invulnerability that often surrounds the region's intellectual and political icons, forcing the populace to confront the reality that greatness and atrocity can occupy the same physical and social space. The enduring silence of the missing electronic devices, once a source of agonizing frustration, has now taken on a different character in the regional consciousness. It has become a symbol of the struggle for transparency that will define the coming decades. Every official report that fails to mention the recovered data and every administrative silence regarding the specific identities of those involved in the evidence's destruction serves only to reinforce the public's commitment to independent oversight. The islands are moving toward a reality where the burden of proof for governmental actions is increasingly resting upon the officials themselves, a shift that is the direct byproduct of the skepticism born in the wake of the 2025 scandal. This evolution is a quiet, steady transformation that may lack the dramatic flair of a courtroom verdict, but it possesses a durability that is far more significant. The legacy of the professor is no longer just a subject for academic mourning. It has become the bedrock for a new political ethic that prizes the integrity of the record above the protection of the reputation. We must also reflect on the enduring nature of the artistic and intellectual vacuum created by the professor's absence. The Galmoana Theater continues to host the vibrant expressions of a new generation of creators, but the air within the auditorium remains heavy with the ghosts of what was lost. This presence is not a mark of defeat, but a call to purpose. The students who now study the methodologies developed by Sinaviana-Gabbard are doing so with a heightened awareness of the fragility of the knowledge they inherit. They are the guardians of a legacy that was tested by the worst of humanity, yet proved resilient enough to provide the framework for their own intellectual development. The tragedy has, in a perverse way, distilled the importance of the professor's work, stripping away any superficiality and leaving behind the core principles of truth-seeking, empathy, and social responsibility. These are the values that continue to animate the cultural discourse, proving that while the individual was silenced, the intellectual spirit she embodied has become more deeply rooted in the islands than it ever was before. The personal resonance for those who suffered the loss of a mentor and a friend is an ongoing, private evolution that continues to inform the public life of the region. They have transitioned from the acute phase of collective trauma into a state of constructive engagement, where the pain of their bereavement is channeled into the protection of the very values the professor lived to defend. The collective narrative of the tragedy has provided a common language for the islands to discuss the dangers of silence, the importance of the independent record, and the absolute necessity of holding power accountable. This common language is a powerful tool for social cohesion, providing a shared understanding that transcends the tribal or familial divisions that once made such accountability difficult to achieve. It is the language of a society that has looked into the abyss of its own failings and chosen to build a bridge across it, using the memory of a beloved scholar as the primary structural support. As the islands look toward the horizon, the lessons of the Galmoana case remain as urgent as the day the tragedy occurred. There is an ongoing recognition that the fight for a transparent society is not a battle to be won and then forgotten, but a continuous duty that must be performed by every generation that inherits the history of this region. The corruption that was exposed in 2025 is not a unique pathology, but a recurring temptation in any system where power is concentrated and the mechanisms of scrutiny are weak. By keeping the story of the professor alive, and by refusing to allow the details of the cover-up to fade into obscurity, the people of the islands are building a defensive barrier against the reemergence of those same forces. They are creating a culture of civic vigilance that will act as the ultimate safeguard for the democratic ideals the professor so deeply admired. This is the ultimate resolution to the tragedy, not a courtroom finality, but a permanent societal commitment to the truth. In the final accounting, the narrative of the Galamoana Theater transcends its geography. It speaks to a global condition where the pursuit of truth is constantly under siege by the forces of expediency and the desire to protect the status quo. The fact that the story has been preserved in such exquisite and painful detail is a testament to the fact that the hunger for justice is a universal human trait. It is a hunger that cannot be satisfied by the formal pronouncements of the law, but only by the thorough and uncompromising exposure of the full historical reality. The professor's life was an attempt to fulfill that hunger through education and cultural preservation, and her death has ensured that the search for justice is now the central mission of the community she served. Her name will be spoken in the halls of the theater for as long as they stand, not as a name of the dead, but as a name of the living principles that continue to guide the intellectual and social life of the Pacific. We leave this chronicle with a final realization, that the true measure of a society is not found in its moments of peace or its periods of prosperity, but in how it responds to the moments when its own foundations are shaken. The Samoan Islands have shown a capacity for deep self-reflection, a willingness to endure the discomfort of painful truths, and a commitment to honor the memory of the dead through the transformation of the living. This is the highest form of justice that can be extracted from the wreckage of such a profound loss. It is a justice that is not found in the prison cell of the guilty, but in the heightened integrity of the society that remains. The light of the professor has not been extinguished. It has been refracted into the 1,000 different struggles of the people who now walk the path she paved for them. Her story is now their story, a permanent, indelible part of the identity of the Pacific Islands, reminding all who come after that the truth is the most sacred inheritance, one that must be defended, honored, and pursued at any cost, regardless of the darkness that may seek to hide it. As we look back one final time at the scene of that May tragedy, we do not see a place of termination, but a place of beginning, a place where the commitment to the truth was forged in the fire of loss, and where the promise of a more transparent future was born, ensuring that the voice of the professor will continue to echo across the islands, guiding the quest for justice for all time to come. The truth, in its totality, has been reclaimed, and in that reclamation, we find the only peace that can ever follow such a devastating and transformational chapter in the human narrative.